We're here today with Anthony Fung from Zalora. This is a company which specialises in online fashion and fashion accessory shoe sales. And he was a panellist at the Global Retail Footwear Conference, which has just finished here in Hong Kong. Well, Anthony, I listened to what you had to say about Zalora. Would you like to give us a little bit of background about your company before we go into more detail?
Sure. So Zalora was established in 2012. Our mission is to be the online fashion destination in Southeast Asia. And we're currently present in 7 countries in Southeast Asia, including Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. We also have, the sister company in Australia and New Zealand called Iconic, which is part of the Zalora group. So the reason why we believe in the Southeast Asia market is because internet penetration is growing at an incredibly fast speed. There's a huge population in Southeast Asia if you combine all the 7 countries together.
How many people are we talking about that in population terms?
So just Indonesia has 300 million people. And if you add all the neighboring countries all together, that's more than 500 million people, which is quite a sizable market.
So it's the same size as the European community, basically.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. It seems to me you're not dealing in brick and mortar stores. You're talking about online here, yeah. Can you tell me the challenges involved in setting up an online operation? Because effectively in Southeast Asia, for the ASEAN region, you're starting, as you said, from a blank piece of paper. How do you go about setting up this
So I think if we think back from 2 years ago and then what has happened in the past 2 years, there were definitely a lot of infrastructural challenges in setting up the online business, right? Because the whole system or the whole ecosystem in Southeast Asia, 2012, back in 2012, there was nothing. So you literally had to rebuild out your whole ecosystem, which, for example, if you think about the online market now, it's predominantly the payment method is cash on delivery. So people only pay when they get their products. Whereas in some of the more mature markets like US, it's credit card. In China, it's Alipay. Whereas in Indonesia, it's still very cash transactional basis, right? So that's one of the things you had to set up. The other thing is, there was no holistic delivery platform in terms of 3PLs. In for example, in US, there's FedEx, DHL, very established players, they can handle the peak volumes very well. In China, there's very established, 3PL players. In Southeast Asia, not really, because the businesses there are used to the very stable, slow growth. Whereas when a new e-commerce player goes in there, with a very exponential growth. Sometimes during peak seasons, for example Christmas or during Ramadan in Indonesia, a lot of the 3PLs can't handle the growth. So I would say the ecosystem there is, when we entered there, we had to rebuild everything from scratch.
So in other words, Zalora was running faster than the system which actually existed in Indonesia, for example,
Exactly.
when you arrived there 2 or 3 years ago. You mentioned in your introduction that you wanted to be the e-commerce platform for fashion products in Southeast Asia, basically. How do you go about choosing these fashion products? You can't represent everybody. How do you choose them? Do you choose them based on segmentation of the consumer demand in each market? How do you actually decide what fashion products you are going to represent?
It's very important to understand who your consumers are in the particular market, because we're currently in 7 different Southeast Asia countries, right? So what consumers want in Singapore and Malaysia is very different from the more emerging markets like Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, right? And I think there's one thing that's very common in all the markets in Southeast Asia is customers love brands. They love all the international brands. So if you have an international brand that is not in Indonesia in the offline stores yet, people will go crazy.
So if you identify that a brand is not, let's say, present in Indonesia or Vietnam, will you approach that brand and try and offer them a deal where you can offer them an e-commerce platform to?
Yes.
to,
So what we do is we usually offer these international brands, like like a pitch that you don't just only sell to Indonesia or you just only sell to Thailand. You sell to the whole Southeast Asia region, and that's a very powerful business case for a lot of these brands, because when they enter Zalora, they're not just entering one market; they're entering the whole region. So that is one thing that we keep in mind, or what we know, customers really love is a lot of these international brands, right? I think the second point is very important is price points. Price points is people are still very sensitive to prices in the region, given the GDP per capita is still low, especially in some of the emerging markets like Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia, right? Obviously, Malaysia and Singapore have less price sensitivity, but that's definitely something that we keep in mind in terms of what brands we want to bring in at the moment. Like, we're not going to bring in like Prada shoes or Gucci shoes because it's still way ahead of the e-commerce curve now.
Regarding internet penetration in the region, you mentioned in your presentation that currently there's about 10% internet penetration, online penetration into Indonesia, which is a lot, which is 30 million people. It's the size of the market where I actually live, right, in South America. How fast do you see this internet penetration developing in the Southeast Asian region? Because the faster it develops, the more potential customers Zalora will have.
Sure. So it also depends on the market, right? So in some of the more mature markets, like Zalora is in, like for example Singapore, Hong Kong, internet penetration is very high. So literally, you go in and you're having a lot of these internet consumers that are very used to e-commerce already. The difference in some of the emerging market economies is even though there's 10% of internet users, for example in Indonesia, which is like 30 million people, the number of people who have actually shopped online is actually still small. Yeah. So in Indonesia, out of the 30 million internet users, there's probably only 5 million customers who have ever shopped online. But this number is growing at like an incredibly fast speed. So if we look at the number of e-commerce users in Indonesia, is actually growing at like 2 to 3 times year-on-year growth, which is quite an extraordinary number and compounding effect if you think about it.
Yeah, you mentioned as well that in the more emerging markets, payment is done cash on delivery, as it used to be in the United States and Britain back in the 1960s, let's say. Do you think that even if people had credit cards, let's say in Indonesia, people do have credit cards, would they, for example, be willing to buy online with a certain fear of online fraud taking place? Because I was always hesitant to put my card number into internet for many years.
Right. So what we see very interesting in the market in Indonesia is, for example, like first-time purchases are usually done by cash on delivery. And once people are used to, our company and making sure it's actually a legit product they're receiving, mm-hmm, and there's no like QC defects, then they start trusting and they switch to bank transfer.
Okay.
But credit card, the problem with credit card is it's the number of credit cards in like Southeast Asia is still very low. Mm-hmm. And the central problem is more like there's not enough credit cards in the system, as opposed to people don't want to use credit cards.
Would it be correct to say that Zalora is a brand which is filling a gap in the Southeast Asian market?
I would say we are a brand, but our brand represents like we are fashion, and we want to be the fashion destination. So
in other words, you want people to say, oh, where did you buy that blouse? Oh, I bought it from Zalora.
What we want to be is like when, for example, historically, when people are looking for stuff, they first go on Google, search for dresses on Google and get redirected to, websites that have fashion. What we want to achieve is we want to be the Google of fashion. So what that means is when people think of buying a new shirt, buying a new pair of shoes, buying a new bag, they go directly to Zalora. And that's what we're trying to achieve, is to be, the Google of fashion.
How are you going about creating awareness of Zalora, let's say as an e-commerce brand, if you like, in the mind of the consumer? Because if you can do that, people say, "Where did you buy that?" "I bought it on Zalora," and they'll automatically go to Zalora.
Yeah.
How are you going about creating this brand awareness of your service?
I think like as an e-commerce platform, we've literally done almost all marketing channels in terms of advertising our brand. For example, like paid marketing, Google, Facebook. We've done TV commercials. We've done traditional media spreads. We work with banks, telcos to spread our name out. But I think in the end, it's all about the products and selection. I fundamentally believe that to succeed in the e-commerce world, you need to have the products and you need to have the brands, you need to have the right price points, right? So for me, it's all about the offering and the prices.
Absolutely, because there'll be no point in paying for TV commercials for Zalora if you have brands which are unknown, for example. It wouldn't make any sense at all.
Exactly. So for me, the product needs to speak for itself. And marketing is just assisting people to find it. If people like the product, if they like the brand, they're going to come back. And that's essentially what is the most important for the Zalora branding.
Okay, excellent. Going back to today's activity at APLF, the Global Footwear Retail Conference, what was your general opinion of that conference as, let's say, the first event of its type here in Hong Kong?
I think it's very interesting because they brought in a lot of different people from different regions, from US, Europe, China, Southeast Asia, with the common theme of how do we enrich the consumer experience, both from the supplier side and from the consumer side, right? So in that respect, it's quite interesting.
Yes. Yeah, I suppose if we have another interview with you in a year's time, you'll have a lot more to tell us about Zalora based on the dynamics of the market in Southeast Asia.
Because the market is changing very fast every day. Like what we've been doing today is very different from a year or even a month ago, right? So you constantly need to readjust your positioning in terms of how do you build a very successful brand, how to build a very successful company in the region.
I think you've got a big challenge ahead, and I'm sure you're going to do a good job of it. Let's do this interview again next year.
Yep, for sure.
Okay, Anthony Fung of Zalora, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.